Why is the subject of history so often maligned and devalued in today's system of education? Why is there so much ignorance among students when it comes to history? Why is history overlooked or underused by so many leaders? Today on the Trumpet Daily, we examine the law of history.
The Philadelphia Church of God presents the Trumpet Daily.
Recently, there was another report about the ignorance of our students when it comes to history. This was from the Associated Press from June 14th, where it says just 13% of high school seniors showed a solid grasp of the subject. And later on in the report, it said results showed that the two other grades didn't perform much better, with just 22% of fourth grade students and 18% of eighth graders demonstrating proficiency. Proficiency in the subject of history, knowing U.S. history of the 7 subjects on the national test that they conduct every year to determine where we are. Students perform the worst in U.S. history. American students, they perform the worst in this particular subject. And that same article in the Associated Press, excuses the ignorance to some degree. I mean, it does identify the problem, which is a start, but it excuses it to some degree by saying that, well, the focus in recent years has been more on math and reading and things of that nature, and you can see why maybe that more teachers are focusing less on history specifically. But if you think about even teaching them how to read, I mean, educators have a responsibility going far beyond the basics of how to read, and to actually teach them, what to read, what they're supposed to study, what they're to dig into, to steer their education. This is a quote from a book I read a number of years ago. It's an old book, What Books to Read and How to Read, by David Pride, written in 1912. He says, in ordinary life, what would we do if we wished to know a man thoroughly? We would, if possible, live beside him and associate with him. We would notice his appearance, his dress, his house, his everyday habits. We would study his demeanor in all the varying scenes of life, in joy and in sorrow, beside his friends and in the presence of his enemies. And we would listen to all his sayings, his careless conversation by the fireside, and his deliberate utterances before the public. And last of all, we would place ourselves in imagination in his circumstances and look at things from his point of view. See, it's not enough, is it, to teach children how to read? We've got to teach them also what's important. We've got to teach them how to ask the right questions, and we've got to teach them who they need to get to know the most. Today, with all the historical revisionism, it's fashionable to give minor characters of history great many pages of text on what they did or didn't do in their lives, and then to give those who really were the towering figures of history, the giants of history, to just reduce their contribution to society down to 1 or 2 pages. This is quite popular to do, and you can see why. I mean, the problems just run through and through. It's not just a matter of having a little more focus on math or reading, but it's rather a calculated effort to undermine the history of this nation, to undermine our spiritual roots, as we'll cover a little bit later. We've lived through this, many of us have, where we've seen this attempt to try to destroy the foundation on which this church was built. And you see it commonly today in the United States and other nations too, I would imagine, in the West. The Wall Street Journal had an article following that study just a few days later where it quoted from David McCullough, the great historian who's written a number of books. He's now into his late 70s, and on his soapbox, as he often is, about the need for history and how we've got to teach our children. You have to admire that man's effort. Even in his 70s, he's still churning out books, writing as much as he can, and fascinated, excited about history. In that Wall Street Journal piece, he said, we're raising young people who are, by and large, historically illiterate. And he would know. I mean, he's lectured at more than 100 colleges around the world over the past 25 years. He's been a teacher, an educator, an author, a journalist. He says, I know how much these young people, even at the most esteemed institutions of higher learning, don't know. He said, it's shocking. It's shocking how much they don't know. And he goes on to say in that article, or he's quoted to say, that it's not the children's fault, but rather it's the teacher's fault. It's the educator's fault. It's the parents' fault. He said, I mean the parents and grandparents of the oncoming generation. We have to talk about history, talk about the books we love, the biographies and histories. He says later in there that the study of history is a source of strength. And this is where we see what's ahead. Let's look at Deuteronomy 32. Deuteronomy chapter 32. I've also quoted before from a speech Mr. McCullough gave back in 2005 in Phoenix, where he talked about this same subject. He said, first of all, we have to get across the idea that we have to know who we are if we're to know who we are and where we're headed. This is essential, going back to our roots, in other words, to understand who we are and to know where we're headed. He says we have to value what our forebears, and not just in the 18th century, but our own parents and grandparents did for us, or we're not going to take it very seriously, and it can slip away. See, our forebears and also our families. We had a gathering recently on Father's Day where we had, I guess, 4 generations in the same house, and we really tried to give special acknowledgement and praise to the 2 grandfathers in the midst. I mean, their offspring was dwelling in that home, and it had expanded greatly over the years. Well, I guess it would have been 3 generations. But the 2 grandfathers that were there, I mean, they started off just with the 2 of them, and then marriage, and then family, and so on. And you learn a lot when you hear what the elder statesmen of the family have to say. And he's encouraging families to be more that way. You can see also another factor as to why we're getting away from our history, just the destruction of family. The fact that there's so many fathers who are missing. I saw another study here recently just on that fact. How many fathers are absent? How many men are producing children out of wedlock? These figures just keep skyrocketing. And we don't have the traditional family unit. We don't have fathers around to tell their children about how it was when they were youths. And no wonder these young people grow up without any historical foundation, really, to speak of. And then they're carted off to school where there's this attempt to destroy the true record of history. And then maybe there's a focus on other things, you know, the technology, the gadgets, and so on. Or the math and the reading, like the AP report says. So many factors contributing to our ignorance, our overall ignorance in society. Mr. McCullough gives the one example where after a lecture at a pretty prominent school, a gal came up, a freshman or a sophomore, I forget which, who was amazed that the first 13 colonies were along the eastern coast of the United States today. She thought maybe they were just scattered all over the place. Had no awareness of the geographical, even just where the first settlers came over. Continuing that quote, he says, if you don't care about it, if you've inherited some great work of art that is worth a fortune and you don't know that it's worth a fortune, you don't even know that it's a great work of art and you're not interested in it, you're going to lose it. See, if you don't appreciate and hang on to that history, you're going to let it go. And furthermore, as he says, you're not going to see where you're going either. There's a proverb that says, where there's no vision, the people perish. And so much of our vision comes from understanding history, knowing our history, knowing where we came from, knowing how it started, knowing how the movie began. Remember how Mr. Armstrong used to say, we've come along later in the movie. We've come along toward the end of the movie. How did this start? How did this world get to be the way that it is today? And you can see where it went off course if you go back to the beginning, if you know the history. You can see what happened, and you can see where this world is headed. So many people don't know, even great historians who may have a real knack for knowing U.S. history or world history. When it comes to Bible history, of course, it's probably quite a lot different. Deuteronomy 32, verse 7, it says, "Remember the days of old, consider the years of many generations. Ask your father, and he will show you, your elders, and they will tell you." See, ask not just your forebears from generations ago, but even your own father, even your grandfathers. Ask them. Ask them the right questions. Moses says here, ask the father, go to the elders, and they'll remind you about what went on before. He's highlighting here the importance of, the indispensable importance of teachers, of fathers, of educators. In that Wall Street Journal article, Mr. McCullough made the point that teachers are the most important people in society, and he's right about that. We are what we are largely because of the teaching, largely because of the system of education. And yet in education today, that's where you find this anti-God agenda, as strong as anything, as strong as ever. God here is saying, look, go to the teachers and look back on that history. What happened in Israel anciently, though? Verse 12, a little further down, "So the Lord alone did lead him, and there was no strange God with him. He made him ride on the high places of the earth, that he might eat the increase of the fields. And he made him to suck honey out of the rock, and oil out of the flinty rock, butter of kine, and milk of sheep, with fat of lambs, and rams of the breed of Bashan, and goats, with the fat of kidneys of wheat. And you did drink the pure blood of the grape." And then verse 15 it says, "But Jeshurun," or Israel, it's just another name for Israel, "waxed fat and kicked. You are waxen fat, you are grown thick, you are covered with fatness. Then he forsook God which made him, and lightly esteemed the rock of his salvation." See, it took it for granted, in other words. Lightly esteemed the rock, or the foundation, the history. That's what's common today, taking things for granted, where we came from, the fight that was there initially to establish this land, or in the case of Israel anciently, what it took to get into the promised land, their journey through the wilderness. Mr. Armstrong said in the last year of his life, he talked quite often about how easy it was to take it for granted, this truth that God's given to us. And then if you look back at that history, and that's just 20, 25 years ago, look at what happened just right after he died, as the men who came along after him just started to destroy what he taught and to deny that history, to change the story, as so many of them did. This is how we concluded Raising the Ruins, the book that really does give that history from what happened after Mr. Armstrong died right up until 2006, when the book was distributed. This is now 5 years ago. And notice what we wrote at the end. It says, "Herbert W. Armstrong died with his mind on reaching the largest audience possible with a message, a commission the Tecachas were dead set against. They stopped the work and ruined everything God had given Mr. Armstrong for the work." It says, "Then God raised it right back up. He began with a small faith-filled ministry intent on delivering the exact same message Mr. Armstrong did. A few people responded to that message and devoted their lives to support that work.